Well, we need to discuss Machiavellian virtue a little bit more thoroughly. Virtue is a major concept for Machiavelli, as I stated in the first lecture, or as in Italian, virtù. And of course, for Machiavelli, that doesn't mean morality, Christian virtue of any kind, religious or otherwise. What it means is ability or skill, and in fact, actually, the rejection of moral virtue. And let me just discuss virtue for Machiavelli generally first, and then we'll discuss some examples of aspects of virtue that Machiavelli provides in The Prince. Well, a good example, according to Machiavelli, of virtue is actually the biblical figure Moses. You may know that he is from the Old Testament, and that he's a revered figure for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Moses is most famous, of course, for saving the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. And what he did, according to the Bible, is he used miracles provided to him by God to frighten the Pharaoh of Egypt into finally letting the people go. And then, of course, God continued to provide Moses and the Israelites with a lot of aid and comfort to get them out of Egypt, even going so far as to provide them with a pillar of fire so that they could follow it by night, and also in the most dramatic case of a miracle, helping them, parting the Red Sea so that they could walk through it to the other side, and then having the Red Sea swallow up the forces of the Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh had decided to come after them after all. Well, that's the biblical account of Moses. So one wonders why Machiavelli would choose Moses, who seemed to do everything well, only because God helped him. And indeed, Machiavelli at first says of Moses that we shouldn't speak of him as an example because he did everything according to God's plan and with God's help. And he almost makes a sort of pious statement that he's sort of above discussion. Don't let that fool you, okay? Because not long after, Machiavelli mentions Moses again and does use him as an example of a great leader. He calls him, however, an armed prophet, and he says all armed prophets are successful and all unarmed ones are failures. And so he attributes Moses' success to his ability to use arms. And he also calls Moses a great founder of a new state and someone who used fortune well. And he then says that Moses found his fortune in the enslaved Israelis. The people were enslaved and miserable, and therefore willing to jump on Moses' political bandwagon, so to speak. So Machiavelli, in the end, treats Moses as a secular military leader, somebody with political skills, and really somebody who was able to use people's religious beliefs to his advantage. That's the cynical view of Moses, very cynical, very realistic, and I think Machiavelli is one of those realists who will deconstruct the biblical accounts and basically say, hey, this person was a leader because of his political and military skill. Those things that we read about, miracles and so forth, must have been examples of political skill and not real. So Moses is a great example, but only if he's deconstructed or revised in the way Machiavelli revises him. Another example, generally of virtue, according to Machiavelli, is a man by the name of Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was the son of Pope Alexander. And yes, that was not supposed to happen then as well as now. But back in those days, the church was experiencing a time of corruption. And actually, Pope Alexander was fairly open about his relationship with women and also his son. And he wanted to be able to help his son, and he did this openly. This may seem very shocking to us today. The church is very different. But this was the period of time right before the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation happened because the church had become very political and corrupt at this time. So given that historical background, maybe this makes a little more sense. Anyway, Cesare Borgia, the son of the Pope, Pope Alexander, willing to help him to become a great ruler himself. And so Machiavelli chooses Cesare Borgia because he says God is on his side. Again, deconstructing or revising what that means. The authority of the Pope was on his side, his power. And at this time, the Pope actually made military alliances and used military force against his opponents. Cesare Borgia was a great leader because he used his connection with the Pope to his advantage. Pope Alexander wanted his son to own some territory of his own, the Romagna, which at this time was to the north of the Papal States, a strip of territory that ran across the peninsula of Italy. And the Pope was willing to help him by lending him some troops that he himself had borrowed from another country. And also the Pope helped him by going into the territory, or having people go there for him, and bribing and promising favors to anybody who might stand in Cesare's way. So Machiavelli says with these helps and with his own political skill, Cesare Borgia came there and was able to conquer the territory fairly easily and rule without controversy. How exactly did he get to the point where he ruled without controversy? Because we know that the Romagna, according to Machiavelli, was full of thieves and all sorts of terrible people, violent behavior, and so forth. Well, Machiavelli says he really performed a trick on the people. What he did was he hired a man by the name of Ramiro de Orco to go into this territory, a governor, and to use whatever ruthless force necessary to subdue them, to make them peaceful. Well, that means that de Orco terrified people. He killed people. He probably ransacked homes. He burned the buildings down. Anybody who even like remotely opposed Cesare's motions, even if they didn't. So de Orco went in there and he just used violence the way that Machiavelli likes it. Cruelty well used. But then Machiavelli says Cesare decided that he wanted to establish good government there in the long run. So what he did was he had de Orco arrested and killed in the most really graphic way. He had him drawn and quartered. He had the pieces of his body laid out in the public square for the people to see, and he sent the message out that de Orco had done the cruel things he did on his own, and that now Cesare Borgia was here and he was going to save the people from any more ruthlessness, and he was going to establish government. And he did, and he established courts of law, and from this time he ruled without controversy. Imagine the minds of the people. On the one hand, they see Cesare as their savior, and this is exactly what Machiavelli admires so much. And they would cooperate with Cesare Borgia because they admired him and thought he was a good guy. But at the same time, in the back of their minds, there was this, yes, but, his employee was de Orco, and de Orco was, capable of the worst possible violence. So they were also fearful of Cesare, so he had the best of both worlds. So Machiavelli says he is the man of incredible virtue. He did everything well. Now he contrasts Cesare in this book with a man by the name of Agathocles, who was an ancient Syracusan official. So this is an example from not Machiavelli's present, but from the ancient past. Now, Agathocles, just to be brief, he did things in a bad way. He wasn't virtuous, according to Machiavelli. One couldn't call him glorious. Because what he did was he decided that he was going to gain power. He was a military figure, and he was going to gain power by basically decapitating the state. He called an assembly of all the nobles, all the politicians, all the great people of Syracuse to inform them about war policy. And then when they all were in one building, the Carthaginians that he had allied himself with came in and they butchered everybody. A bloodbath. Now, of course, he ruled without controversy, at least initially, but the problem with Machiavelli, or for Machiavelli, is that Agathocles was so brutal that it couldn't be ignored, and he could not distance himself from this violence. He couldn't blame anybody else. He didn't even try. And so, unlike Borgia, who came into the Romagna with goodwill from the people, Agathocles came into Syracuse being hated and feared excessively by people, which would mean that at some point down the road, somebody would try to knock him off. Okay, and this is not good. This is not smart, and so Machiavelli says this is not virtuous. So you see that Agathocles, somebody who used a great deal of violence, still is not admired by Machiavelli. There has to be finesse. Finesse, very important concept in Machiavellian cruelty. Everything must happen with finesse, and it is much better to deceive people and get them to go along with you than to tell them or show them the absolute brutal truth. So hopefully these examples give you a better idea of Machiavelli's general notion of virtù. But now I want to briefly discuss several examples, aspects of virtù, specific advice that Machiavelli gives to any new ruler. One aspect of virtù is parsimony. This is an old-fashioned word that you may not have even heard before, but what it means is thriftiness, not blowing money or resources, but saving them. Being careful with your resources. If you were going to be critical of a person with parsimony, you might call them cheap. Now, Machiavelli says that it is better to be considered cheap than to be considered too generous. Well, that's strange, because you know Machiavelli wants the leader to be well liked, or at least trusted, but why does he then go and tell him that he should get a reputation for cheapness? Well, Machiavelli says that in the long run, the reputation for being cheap won't really hurt you all that much. After all, the people won't be overtaxed. They'll get to keep more of their own money to do their own thing with. They'll be able to build businesses and enhance their farming and so forth and make more money themselves. And so, though they may grouse about how cheap you are, you're still going to be fairly well liked. But if you spend lots of money, especially if it's not other people's money. It's okay if you like raid another city and take their money and spend it. But if you are using your people's money to build lavish buildings, to put on great events for yourself and your friends, and to fight needless wars and so forth, you're going to have to take so much of your people's money that they will begin to really feel it. You will get the reputation, he says, for being rapacious. That is, you will get the reputation for being somebody who is cruel in the amount of money that you take from people. And remember, the tax man at this time was not an IRS bureaucrat sending you a form or sending you a warning letter. The tax man was the guys that worked for the prince, who went out on their horses and torched your house and your village if you didn't comply. Okay, knocked on your door and wreaked havoc upon your lands, your family, and so forth if you didn't pay up. So certainly you can imagine that this type of thing would cause great hatred, and whenever there's hatred, there's always somebody willing to plot and scheme to overthrow you, and you don't want that. So that's why Machiavelli recommends parsimony. Another example of an aspect of virtù is Machiavelli's advice to be feared but not hated, and this sort of follows from what was said before. Machiavelli says that it's okay and actually very necessary to be feared, but you should not be hated. Now let's think about this a little bit. You might think, well, how could you not have both at the same time? If you're feared, aren't you necessarily going to be hated? Well, think about your own parents. Now, I realize not everybody comes from the same kind of background, but many of us had parents that we feared, but we didn't hate. In fact, we actually loved them. I certainly did. I knew that if I did wrong, it had to be something fairly serious, but if I did something wrong, like lie or endanger myself, I was going to get a spanking when I was real little, or I was going to get some form of punishment when I was older. And yet, I also knew that my parents wouldn't do that if I didn't do something wrong. And I could respect that. And so I did fear them in the sense of fearing them if I was doing something wrong or thinking about it, but I certainly didn't hate them. This is the type of authority that Machiavelli wants the prince to have, that sort of stern parental authority in which people realize that if they sort of keep their heads down and do their jobs, obey the law, the prince will not only not harm them, but his policies will actually help them. Only if they break the law or begin to foment some sort of political unrest is the prince going to come down on them and punish them. So the prince has established rules that are firm and solid and that the people know, and that kind of fear, the fear of breaking the law, is a good fear, and it comes without hatred. Another example of an aspect of virtue is a very interesting and famous case of Machiavelli's advice to be like the beasts. Well, that sounds like, just be like a big lion or tiger and just destroy. But he goes on to elaborate. He says, there are two kinds of fighting. Those with that type of fighting with laws, and that's proper to man, and the type of fighting that uses force, and that's proper to the animals, to the beasts. Now, sometimes you can fight like a human being and use the laws, but many times you have to use force. But then he goes on and he says there are two types of two types of animals that the prince needs to learn how to emulate. One is the lion, certainly. That's what we just talked about, the use of brute force. But there's also the fox. And that's the animal who uses deception and fraud and appearance, the tricky one. Now, Machiavelli thinks that it is imperative to learn the fox. Brute force only goes so far. If you use it too much, you get hated. But there is this other kind of force. It may be kind of strange to you to think of deception as a form of force, but what force is getting people to do things you want them to do that they would otherwise not do. And if you deceive them, you are in effect forcing them in that way. You can deceive them by being religious, at least on the surface, but not on the inside. By doing generous acts to get their trust and their admiration, but always reserving the possibility that you'll need to be cruel. Machiavelli gives a laundry list of different ways of deceiving in this book. And so you have to learn, he says, how to balance the lion and the fox and to use deception. And the most important thing, the thing that you're going to use the most, is the fox. So we might say Machiavelli is the first political advisor. Certainly James Carville or Mary Madeline are examples of contemporary Machiavellians who try to put certainly the best face on their candidates and use images and appearances to create an impression. We might not say that they promote fraud, but I think you get the point. The impression that you leave on people makes all the difference in the world as to whether they will cooperate with you or begin to fight against you. Another aspect of virtue is just simply popularity. Machiavelli spends quite a bit of time elaborating on what we've said before about the need for the prince to be well liked, to get the support of the people, he says, is the best shield against conspiracies. He says that, the best case is when the people see that their interests coincide with the prince. And so, in another aspect of virtue, Machiavelli says that the prince should show himself to be a lover of enterprise and a promoter of excellence. You know, it doesn't take much time, effort, or money to show the people that you love their excellence. You can do this by creating honors and awards for people, creating titles for people that's based just on the contributions that they make to the economy, to science, to the arts, and so forth. You can encourage trade, not just by lowering taxes, but also by pointing out to the rest of the community the better business people, the people who have really made new inventions or are opening up new ways of trading. You can also reward good citizenship. You can single out people for awards, for celebrations, great soldiers, men who have truly risked their lives in battle and have performed great acts of heroism, citizens that have come to the aid of their country in an emergency, who have helped their fellow citizens in times of need. You can do all this again without spending a lot of money, and it creates an incentive for people to work hard and to admire excellence. He also advises, though he doesn't want you to spend lots of money, that a prince should indeed provide occasional feasts and festivals for people as a whole, so that he creates a sense of unity and patriotism in his people. So things like, you know, our July 4th and our Memorial Day, and even our holidays such as Christmas and Easter are examples that, you know, the state should not discourage but encourage people celebrating as a unity, because this too is very good for morale. Another example from the general category of virtue is resolution. Now this is very good advice for everybody, I think. Machiavelli says that a wishy-washy person who sits on the fence or will not take sides will be distrusted by everyone. So a prince cannot be neutral, for instance, in a war between two neighboring cities. Even if you happen to ally yourself with the side that loses the war, at least you have a reputation for being a good ally, for sticking to your word, and you're more likely to be asked to help out, to be an ally of a more powerful country in the future, because you're going to have a reputation for resolute behavior. Okay? If you backtrack, if you back out, if you are neutral and won't openly take sides, you get a reputation for being untrustworthy. Other people don't know where you're coming from. You're much more likely to be dropped yourself in an alliance, or to just be left to fend for yourself in times of need. So Machiavelli is saying here, in other words, yes, you do need to be concerned with your reputation. You can't be so ruthless or so snake-like that you can't win at least friends of self-interest. You're not talking about friends of virtue in the old-fashioned sense, but friends of self-interest. If you can't even win the alliances that you need, then you've gone too far in the area of deception. Finally, one aspect of virtue is prudence. Now, again, that's an old-fashioned word, not used a whole lot anymore, but prudence means good judgment of other human beings. Within your administration, you should manage people with care. You should pay attention to their personalities, their characters, in general and also in specific individuals. Become aware of their weaknesses and realize that you also have weaknesses. A good example of prudence is, Machiavelli says that you should guard against advisors who flatter. He says advisors are absolutely necessary. You need them because you can't think about everything in the world well. You need people to digest information for you and give you advice. But it's very likely that advisors will be tempted to flatter you, to tell you what you want to hear, to make you feel great, because They want to empower themselves. Well, there's a wonderful aspect of human nature that we really all know about, but we don't like to think about. People want to advance themselves, and they'll do that by being nice to you, by flattering you and telling you what you want to hear. And of course, this has got to be particularly the case with leaders who have so much to offer: riches, power, and status. So, in other words, Machiavelli says the prince needs to be aware, number one, that people will be flatterers in this advisor position, and number two, that the prince is likely to fall for that flattery if he isn't constantly on his guard and reminding himself that it's just flattery. Well, how do you deal with this in the long run so that you don't set yourself up to be tempted by flattery? Machiavelli says, well, you hire your advisors and you say to them, you can tell me about anything once I ask. You can say anything about the subject I ask for. You can't just come to me anytime you want with any situation and with any advice. Only if I ask you. Give me advice about this neighboring country. What should I do? Then you can say whatever you want to about that, but not about everything else in the world. I will not punish you for saying things that anger me, that I disagree with, under those limited conditions. There's an old saying, familiarity breeds contempt, and an advisor who can come in anytime he wants and talk to you about anything he wants to talk to you about is way too familiar, according to Machiavelli. So put some distance between them, but also let them know that they don't have to fear your wrath if they give you advice that you don't like on a subject that you've asked for. Well, I think that's good advice even for bosses in businesses today.